Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. The CEA is the voice of the electricity industry in Canada. My name is Farhan Mirza, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. The Conversation series features presentations from CEA's corporate partners, and the series will highlight a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by the industry. Working with CEA's corporate partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space, from generation through to the customer. For a list of upcoming sessions, check out CEA's website at www.electricity.ca. Before we get going, there are a few housekeeping items that I wanted to remind you of. Our session today is scheduled to run from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Questions can be asked, and we encourage you to do so as they come to mind by typing them into the chat function on your screen. They will be asked at the end of the presentation. And a brief survey will be sent to webinar participants following the session today. We would very much appreciate your candid feedback and are interested in any topics you would like to have included in the conversation series in the future. Also, please keep an eye out for future webinars and events through CEA's monthly newsletter, Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs, much like the national newspaper, is the place to go for Canadian industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation to the customer. If you'd like to receive Current Affairs and you're not currently getting it, you can subscribe to this free publication via CEA's website at electricity.ca. Today, Guidehouse will be presenting our webinar, and our topic is Asset Management to Assets Investment Planning. With a dynamic and increasingly fast-paced industry, traditional approaches to asset management are being challenged to position utilities for innovation and growth. A data-supported value framework underpinning a more robust asset investment planning function is becoming essential to drive the future of utility organization. Today, Guidehouse will bring insight from in-field projects to demonstrate the benefits of a more comprehensive value framework that drives not just asset management, but directing of capital to the right places for growth transformation. Our presenters today from Guidehouse are Craig Sabine, Director Energy Providers in Leader Canada, and Sitha Nyan, Director Utility Solutions Group at Guidehouse. Craig and Sitha, welcome to the Conversation series. We'll turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Farhan, for the introduction and to the CEA. As always, for inviting us to speak to the membership, and we're real excited to do that today. I think it was just a little over a year ago when I participated in the last conversation series, and we were just getting into the first wave of COVID. So here we are again, at least in Ontario, back in the thick of it. I do hope that everyone out there is staying happy and healthy and doing what they can to keep their loved ones tight. So I know it is some challenging times for us, and it's great to be able to connect through the technology that we have and continue to do our work. And I don't know everyone who's out there today listening, but I'm sure I know many of you, and I look forward to being able to be with you again in person when we can get to it. Today I wanted to talk about asset management and really investment planning and how that comes together with capital allocation in our industry, and how we see that evolving. I did want to highlight, for those of you who don't know me or Guidehouse, we are a multinational professional advisory and consulting firm. We have significant focus in the energy and utility space. In Canada, we've been around for nearly 30 years now, formerly as Navigant, and we provide everything from corporate strategy to operations and improvement to regulatory support and transactional advice to the energy and utility sector from coast to coast in Canada. And I do want to draw your attention to an offer that we have for CEA members today, for those who are participating in today's webinar. Guidehouse Insights, which is our syndicated research arm of the company, a number of products and reports and research that they cover could be very useful data inputs in regards to what we're going to be talking about today. So I thought it would be interesting to highlight that function and service does exist, and there's a lot of interesting market research and data available, and we're going to provide that any single report to CA members at a discount, which you can use the discount code CEA10 to access anything that you may find of interest. So I encourage you to go check out Guidehouse Insights, something that not a lot of our Canadian clients know Guidehouse and formerly Navigant for, but it does exist. So what we'll cover today. We're going to start with looking at the drivers of change. We've talked a lot about the energy transition over the last several years, I think, both with you directly, and I know all the utilities across the country have been thinking about it and focusing on transformation. And we'll talk about it in the context of asset management, investment planning, and capital needs. We'll look at the role of value frameworks in optimizing that investment planning at the enterprise level, and that's really going to be the core of the discussion today, and the power that a value framework can really offer. And then we'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of innovation and how you might look at valuing innovation differently to allow it to flourish. And then fundamentals of comparing traditional and transformational investments. And we'll do a short wrap up and of course a Q&A at the end. So diving in, we sort of, as I mentioned, we've all talked about for the last 5 to 10 years this extreme and sort of dynamic transformation that's happening in the global energy system. So why are we talking about that today in the context of asset management? Well, how does the energy transition relate to asset management and investment decision making? As we see transition happening, utility organizations will continue to face greater competition. I think that we often talk about that competition and when it's going to begin to reduce competitiveness of the utility business. But at the same time, those disruptions and changes are also leading to utility organizations in Canada and globally really to face an environment that is a much more complex environment in terms of investment choices and decision making and the velocity at which you have to make those decisions. And we think that taking an asset management and portfolio optimization approach can really help. So to be successful in the long term, we are really beginning to see that utilities will need to transition along with the industry, of course. Earnings growth continue to become challenged. New revenue sources will be needed for the financial viability of the utility and rate regulated businesses. Costs unfortunately aren't compressing along with demand that we see compressing in many jurisdictions and in many markets. For years we've done, in combination with Public Utilities Fortnightly, a survey of utility executives, and every survey for the past 5 years has really focused in on the idea that balancing traditional investment with innovative and transformational investments is growing in importance, and that the anticipation for growth in the utilities business continues to be challenged more and more each year. And we've seen these themes playing out every year that we do the survey. What I'd like to do now before we get to the next is do a quick poll with the audience. I'd like you to think a little bit about the first 2 slides and what that means for your organizations and for your teams and what your team's mandates are. So how important will utility investment in transformational assets be, or transformational business models, to contribute to your organization's long-term value? And I think Farhan has opened the poll. So Farhan, will I see the results come up here on?
You should see the result now. %79% say essential, 16% not clear, and 5% not important at all.
Okay, great, thanks. I don't see it, so that's helpful if you can let me know. I think we have one more poll as well. I think as expected, overwhelmingly, the belief is that transformational investment making and finding a way to balance traditional utility asset investment with transformational or innovative assets is a must for future financial viability of the utility business, and that is, very much aligned with what we've been hearing in our survey annually with public utilities fortnightly. So thank you for their participation. What I want to do is highlight that point a little bit further by taking a bit of a view on capital flows. This is primarily focused on North America and Europe, but we do see that utility organizations are making investments in transformational platforms, as we call them, or energy cloud platforms, as Guidehouse has coined them. We believe that utility organizations are uniquely placed within the value chain to support, accelerate, and prosper from the energy transition. And I want to explore a little deeper if that advantage position is really helping thus far. Each quarter, we track utility investment, and I want to emphasize the utility investment on this slide, in energy cloud platforms, as we call them. We define those as anything other than centralized power generation and typical traditional linear poles and wires transformer type assets. Each quarter we track the investment in energy cloud platforms, and there's a clear and growing focus in making transformational investments. Right now we're estimating it to be, over the last 5 years, about 27 billion annually. There was some clear growth from 2015 to 2019 and a bit of a decline in 2020 that we believe is primarily related to shift in focus due to the COVID crisis. But from a utility point of view, we still see a lot of investment in wholesale renewable generation as the leading investment focus, both in terms of direct investment and in terms of acquisitions or M&A activity. We believe renewable generation as being part of the energy cloud platform, if you will. But again, a lot of the utility focus is in that one area. And with a growing amount in things like data analytics and distributed generation, network infrastructure and architecture, and industrial energy management types of products and services. But when we look at the bigger picture, we look at the amount of capital that is flowing to energy cloud platforms and alike investments in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. We see 501 billion. So other players are out there investing in energy transition and finding ways to attach the appropriate value and risk profile to make investments in the energy transition. And that 501 billion obviously outstrips by quite a lot the amount that utilities are investing. So we see this in the capital markets flowing from funds into transitional investments and finding alternatives to utility balance sheets. Oil and gas companies are moving capital into the energy transition, of course, OEMs, transportation companies, and direct investments through share issues and public offerings within the capital markets. Changes in these future business models and revenue models are going to present a lot of challenges for utilities, which we are beginning to see in terms of the potential for revenue growth, but also a lot of opportunities. So given that the new needs of utility services are fundamentally linked around the concept of the 4Ds, right? Decarbonization, decentralization, digitization, and democratization, certainly primarily those first three, there's new value frameworks are going to need to emerge and be required so that we can fairly assess the challenges in the industry and the value of these opportunities to our organizations. Core to this transformation is a reimagined approach at looking into investment needs at the enterprise level, which is more akin to a broad-based investment portfolio manager rather than a utility functional area, while establishing a deep understanding and alignment of the operational and other risks that the organization is able to quantify and set the risk tolerances around. For example, what are the impacts of ROE on declining bulk system load growth? Or what are the risks in not meeting the changing customer needs and the risks involved in antiquated business models that are slow to change due to regulators having difficulty changing their regulatory frameworks or their legislative model? What new revenue opportunities are going to exist, and how can we attach value to them in a much more diverse and complex manner? Before we get into some of the framework ideas that Sitha is going to share, I would like to just highlight a case study. So we have been working for a little over 2.5 years with TVA, who 3 years ago really identified some significant challenges within their business model. And what we were seeing is a significant amount of down pressure on both the capital and O&M spending that they were allowed. Their historic funding targets were based on static and historic figures and not very well tied to the future risk profile of the business. Their key business processes were not standardized. There was inadequate access to data and system interface to allow an enterprise view of the capital plan. So we got in there and we really looked to optimize the different portfolios, prioritize investments based on a total value as opposed to historic performance, increase the visibility to the top, increase visibility at the enterprise level, of course, reduce dependency on multiple tool sets. So I think you'll always be in a position where a number of tools will be needed and integration required, but in many cases, a large number of bespoke spreadsheet-based models would be used to develop business cases to support investment decision making. We'd rather see that reduced and have a much more efficient approach that rationalizes applications and reporting needs together. And then, of course, leveraging tech, so harmonizing the application across the organization and fully leveraging the power of the ERP and replacing a lot of the manual work that is needed. And we put them on a 2.5-year roadmap. And we're not complete with this work yet, but we think that we've made a lot of great progress. And we may be able to share some more examples of that progress throughout the rest of the presentation today. For that, I will leave it to Sitha.
All right, thanks, Craig, and thanks everybody for having me speak today. I just want to do a quick introduction to myself. I'm Sitha Nan. I'm a director in our utility solutions practice with Guidehouse. I've been with Guidehouse for a little over 10 years. Before that, I spent my time as a telecommunications engineer, working on implementing technology solutions and also managing large capital asset decision-making in the telecom space. Then went over to the software development space and then hopped over to the consulting world. For the past few years, been primarily focused on developing program portfolio management solutions within the utility space. And one of the solutions happens to be around integrated investment planning. So really happy to speak here today and hopefully answer any questions. So before we jump into value frameworks, just wanted to put this example out there so that we can kind of acknowledge that fundamentally investment decision making is just a big challenge just across the board for many organizations, if not all organizations. And in this example, you may see something that you can relate to, based on your experience and your history within the utility space. Let's say, for example, we have a project that's focused on replacing a small set of transformers because there's been some indication that they're aging and it's increasing risk in terms of reliability and safety. And on the other hand, we have another investment that is centered around, a new software system, maybe an application for OMS, which has a completely different set of costs and project duration, and has different values in terms of reliability, but also has value for potentially addressing some cybersecurity concerns, and has its own execution risk. When you're faced with this challenge, how do you make the decision on which one to fund first? And imagine if you had to do that across thousands of projects across your portfolio. How do you make these trade-off analysis to make a decision on what makes the most sense, and how do you justify that internally in terms of what is the most important, and how do you justify that externally? So you may get different responses on what makes sense to invest in based on who you ask within your organization. You may get different responses within your organization purely because of different jurisdictional requirements. If you have an organization that is placed in different locations, and you may just have different responses based on who you ask, different organizations, because of what they value strategically. So all this is just an example of how complex decision making is. I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to that. But this is the reason why we're talking about value frameworks. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, I think we've got a poll question for the group. And the question is, in your experience with capital investment planning, what are the key barriers that create challenges for you in your organization? And the options are whether investments have a strategic fit, whether there's a misalignment with the regulation and with the regulators and their expectations, whether there's a lot of internal politics that kind of trump those decisions, or if it's because of a bunch of siloed planning within your organization. So we'll give a moment for the numbers to tally up there. All right, so very interesting response here. So we see that 55% are the barriers are due to siloed planning, which continues to be a theme. But I think the way I would have expected to kind of see this is kind of across the board, across many of our clients, who are seeing that all of the above typically is the answer. But siloed planning and the way in which you bring different investment requests from different lines of business within your organization and make decisions across those different lines of business is a continuing issue. And value frameworks are a central part of enabling, breaking down the barriers between, for siloed planning. So I'm very happy to see that response. Okay, so let's kind of add on to the challenges of what we talked about with investment decision making, and that's that's a lot of the concepts I think Craig was speaking to about the shift in the industry in terms of wanting to move more towards transformational planning. And you've got these competing challenges across different needs of the organization. One is to maintain your core business needs, right? To keep the lights on, to maximize CapEx, reduce OpEx. Then making sure that your employees and resources are being used as efficiently as possible. On the other hand, you've got a lot of competition coming out within the industry, and we're seeing a need to kind of evolve our business model a bit. and to figure out how to grow in ways that are a little bit less traditional. And then we're seeing larger kind of transformational trends around the need to transition to more clean energy, to be more digital, to decentralize and make a more flexible network. So all these are kind of competing impacts that really make that decision making even harder. And a lot of those things don't necessarily have a way to kind of quantify value against that. So, going back to the example, just looking between two different projects is hard enough to define value that people can understand. But when you add on these different layers of needs with for an organization, that makes that even more difficult to deal with. So what we need is a value framework in order to, fairly conduct trade-off analysis between different investments. Okay, so here's a view of why value frameworks can add some value. It provides a common scale to compare proposed investments. Having a value framework helps keep different parts of the organization engaged. So it's no longer about having individuals come up with investment requests and making that, a siloed planning process. You can actually pull different parts of the organization together to collaborate on defining and scoring the values of different investments. You can keep discussions aligned to strategy. So it's not just about kind of legacy, kind of status quo allocation of funds, but strategy continues to evolve. So your investment decisions need to continue to evolve with that. And having a value framework gets people to recognize the full value of a project according to that changing strategic framework. But value frames are also a very objective way to helping different parts of the organization understand why we make investment decisions internally, but also externally, and also to shareholders and other stakeholders and constituents that may have interest in some of the decisions that you're making to fund certain projects. But the key to this is that value framework should be applied throughout the entire project lifecycle. Right? It's not just about planning investments, but it's also about optimizing those investments, being able to justify it, and being able to use that same framework as a means to monitor and track the benefits of those investments, and to be able to conduct any type of variance analysis so we can continually evolve the way we approach investment planning within your organization. So it's not something you do just to kind of score projects, but it's something that has to be applied throughout the enterprise across different stakeholder groups, but throughout the project lifecycle as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know Craig has touched on this pretty well already, but another value for value frameworks is being able to support that transition for organizations to move from traditional investment planning to more strategic investment planning. So what we're seeing is a shift in a lot of our clients where people are starting to ask questions about, how can we start to articulate the value of making some strategic decisions? How do we capitalize on business opportunities? How do we address some of the risks in terms of the way the industry is being shaped, where we have to make decisions to mitigate those risks as opposed to some of the legacy kind of asset sustainment related risks, which typically undermine or basically pin the traditional investment planning processes that we commonly see today. On the more traditional side, we see a lot more assessment based on risk and asset risk. And on a transformational side, we're seeing a need to make decisions based on value. So it's what else can we get from making these decisions in specific assets, but also making more innovative types of investments that may not be only related to assets, but different ways of working within your business as well. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a view on maturity assessment of how we like to kind of frame an initial discussion of where we see some of our clients today. Starting from the left side, we see commonly a lot of organizations kind of stuck within stage 1, stage 2, where there's a lot of legacy allocation of capital to their line of business because it's historically what they're used to doing. It's historically what checks off the box. It's historically what's been approved by regulators. we're seeing a little bit more transition to more advanced prioritization techniques. So, more modernized Excel spreadsheets and tools to help quantify the values of different investments, models that help you prioritize those investments and help strengthen the justification of that. But as you start to look at what we define as much more mature, forward-looking organizations is when you start to apply value frameworks that create that common scale and definition of value for all sorts of different projects across your enterprise, but then also using that and applying processes and defining roles, getting the right tools, standardizing the data that's necessary in order to enable true portfolio optimization, not just within your line of business, but across the enterprise as well. So we're starting to see more of a shift towards that. And the dream is to get to a point where we can start making decisions by collaborating across the enterprise to actually move more towards more proactive strategic decision making. So it's not just about sustaining your assets, but let's all collaborate together from different parts of the organization, whether it be from your asset management group to your financial group to your innovation group to your customer engagement group. All those different entities should be able to work together and collaborate via value framework to make these decisions and to justify these projects. Next slide, please. So how do we approach value frameworks? So this is an outline of a 4-step process, and I think at this point it's important for me to recognize that part of what we identify as being a mature organization in terms of enabling the use of value frameworks to make better asset or enterprise investment decisions is having good commercial grade technology software. And we are a partner with Copperleaf Technology as a solution provider of the software that we are developing go-to-market solutions for around value frameworks and around developing processes and other tools in order to enable enterprise investment planning. And a lot of what we have in common is the fact that we approach the definition of value frameworks in the same way. You start out with identifying criteria that aligns the greatest value of the organization to your investments. So they have to be aligned to strategic objectives. And then you need to conduct discussions and workshops with the different stakeholders that represent different parts of the organization who drive the definition of investment needs and help justify them to test out that criteria and see how it can work across a real set of investments and compare how does the result of having that value framework to score investments compared to what they traditionally would have thought, and to explore the differences there. And I think that process alone can open up a lot of eyes in terms of understanding how value framework can really help change the way that we approach investment planning. And ultimately, from there, use that same value framework to really optimize your investments and make decisions on what to invest in now and what to defer for investment later. So all of this requires a bunch of number crunching, obviously, and is another reason why we like to point at having a really good technology platform to enable that decision making, because when you start to look at how you score these investments to optimize your portfolio, you also have to apply that across how values change across time. You have to apply that with the fact that as projects are being executed, things change, constraints change, values change. So you have to go back and re-optimize your portfolio based on those changes, and that typically results in a lot of manual rework and data crunching that can easily be solved with really good technology platform that's been set up effectively to begin with. Just a real quick kind of overview of what we see as the strategic components of a comprehensive value framework. We've talked a lot about the strategic imperatives that need to be incorporated in terms of aligning criteria. We need to define a common set of measures, and these measures are what's important to identify the exact value that different investments can bring to the organization in a common and standard way. There needs to be a component of having models that will help actually convert investments into quantifiable measure values. And then we need a component of the value framework that figures out what to do with those measures and those values. So we talked a little bit about portfolio optimization. Once you have values assessed across your different investments, you can now start to do some pretty complex analysis on what an ideal portfolio looks like based on constraints. You can start to calculate projected impact to key performance metrics within your organization as they align to your strategic imperatives. So there's different ways to kind of use the values that come out of scoring these investments using the value framework. Next slide, please. Just a really quick example of value measures and value models that have been designed for an organization that we've worked with. So you'll see some of the strategic imperatives on the left and how they've been grouped to align value models to those imperatives. A lot of these, as you may note from looking at this, is really based on risk. And the big challenge that I think every organization faces is trying to make sure that everybody understands that this is what an organization has decided as their comprehensive set of values that can be used to justify investments. And what we're seeing is with some organizations who have already started to take the journey towards developing value frameworks, there's a gap in terms of organizational awareness and a culture in terms of being able to adopt the use or the way of thinking about how to apply the value models to justify their investments. So that is a very important piece of, I think, what we are recommending in terms of value models is not just having the value models alone, but also all the processes and cultural change that needs to happen in order to get the organization to start thinking this way. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So here's a really high-level example of, again, referring back to TVA, a client that we supported with implementing value frameworks and enterprise investment planning within their organization. The example that Craig walked through earlier is a good case study of how they've enabled that internally, and part of that effort involved creating a value framework within the enterprise to make decisions internally, but also to be able to justify that externally. But as we noticed, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of times those value frameworks are based on risk. This is an example of where we're continuing to support TVA as they start to embark on how they can strategically transform their role within the region that they support. So part of the effort that we're supporting is facilitating workshops and exploring what are the definitions and the value propositions for supporting the area that TVA supports across, not just with TVA, but also for its customers and for the end users, the consumers of the electricity. And all those kind of have their own definition of values, but we're looking at trying to define value propositions that can be commonly shared across the different constituents within the region. And if you move on to the next slide, what we found was that a lot of what has been discussed and identified are value categories that kind of move away from risk and more towards creating more value within the region. And a lot of these values are aligned to end use customer focused types of values. Some are aligned to more collaborative planning type of values and optimization of assets and also the use of the area itself. So these are things that will eventually have to be, that we're continuing to support and will eventually have to be modeled and incorporated into a larger structure. Next slide, please. So the reason why we went over that really high-level example in terms of how we're defining new value models is because we believe that you can start to build upon your existing capabilities today to start making that transformation from traditional investment planning to more strategic investment planning. So part of that is defining a value framework, and that value framework needs to be a common definition of risk, but also common definition of values that can be applied to making investment decisions within your organization. If you apply the right processes, the right governance models, and you put in the work to clean up the data and enable the tools in order to manage this, you can really start to balance out the different needs of organizations. So you're not just making decisions to sustain your assets, but you're also making decisions to move more strategically. And it balances between value and risk appropriately, not only just to justify that internally, but also with your stakeholders and to the regulators. So that said, I'll hand it back over to Craig.
All right, thanks, Sitha. Sorry, sometimes my tech is a little challenged. So there's only a couple more slides left, and then we can jump into Q&A. But I did want to highlight the idea of using value frameworks within the context of transformational investment making, and how that really requires a much more complex business model to be valued, and sometimes that's where a lot of the challenges can come in. The business models are more complex, which leads to more complex investment programs that utilities will need to really capture the value in those assets once the investment is made, because a lot of these assets require multiple revenue streams, or what we call value stacking. The benefit streams for these types of assets are much more fragmented, and therefore those values must be, or use cases must be stacked on top of one another to achieve the desired revenue or financial outcome. Think about key smart grid features, right? A lot of the types of assets within the smart grid require value to be stacked, and they also are synergistic with one another. So you need to invest in more than one of them to sort of capture the value in all of the use cases that might be available. And you can see that on the left set of charts. The benefits and costs of these few investment projects requires all of these assets to be invested in to capture the same type of value that you're expecting. So it becomes much more of a portfolio, or as we've been using today, enterprise-wide mindset, where you're really looking at asset management, right? How do we manage the existing assets in the whole portfolio and get the most out of them? Investment planning, what do we invest in new? What do we replace? What do we change? And all that converges with the idea of capital allocation. Where does capital flow to and why? And that's really the business case that we're trying to build up. So you have your capital inputs, the business and the system needs, in the case of a utility, informs the project level economics, but then you require the value framework to truly make the right risk, or in our context, value adjustment, right? Adjusting the BU segment NPVs or the project NPVs for identified value and risk modifiers, and then adjusting the project returns accordingly. And this gets you a more enterprise view of the financial impact, which may lead to an investment plan, or may lead to a feedback loop, where you then go through the process of optimization. And depending on the maturity of the system and the processes built around this, you'll be able to have the appropriate feedback and the appropriate optimization going on in the enterprise evaluation. I sort of to me, it's a little bit akin like putting together a baseball team if you're a general manager, right? You got to know and understand the game really, really well first. Then you can work on the assets that you have, the players that you have, diversifying those assets and spreading those risks and highlighting their values. And then you change the game, right? You're innovating, you're creating the value stack, you're changing the game, and ultimately you're going to get your growth, and you're going to add your value to your system, to your stakeholders, and to your shareholder. And that is sort of akin to winning the game when we look at the metaphor. And this is the last slide, really. We talked a lot about the value framework, of course, and the components of what make up the value framework and how to operationalize it. We talked about the features and the input to a value framework and what organizations are thinking about and why. And really, it's just the first two steps on a journey towards an enterprise investment optimization type of approach, right? It's the future state visioning. What do we want to have? What do we need? And then looking at the development of a common value framework across the enterprise. You're still going to require the governance structure and the changes to the governance model to enable it. Of course, then, Sitha talked a little bit about the tools, the data analytics, the integrated system that would be required to support the execution or operationalization of that value framework. And, as you go along, you're going to obviously pilot and sort of work your way towards an integrated process before you implement the full program and then deploy and support and continuously improve over the long term. So it's a bit of a journey, like anything else that is transformational, but it's highly dynamic and we believe with the state of the marketplace today, the need for a shift in this type of planning and capital allocation process is really required. So I think with that, Farhan, we would turn it over to you again and see if there's any questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that great presentation, Craig and Sitha. I thought it was very, very insightful. I'd like to remind our audience again, feel free to type your questions into the chat function as you see on your screen there in the questions panel, and we'll get to them as we can. We actually had a question right off the bat that I wanted to address to you folks. Craig and Sitha, do you have any recommendations on quality management applications to ensure measures and constraints are accurate?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So do you have any recommendations on quality management applications to ensure measures and constraints are accurate?
Well, my view is that that's part of what you would want to evaluate as part of the journey, right? What are the tools and tech that you need to support? And then some of that is process and governance related as well, right? How do you put the right controls in place to ensure that all the parts of the organization are aligned in delivery of the value framework and ensuring that there's consistency in the inputs to the extent that the value framework is meant to drive that consistency. So I think a lot of it is about developing the right process controls, procedures, and establishing, up front the right culture for change and managing the change that the organization as a whole needs to go through, so that the inbound information and data is coming from the right places and is consistent across the different parts of the organization and across the different projects that would be going into the value framework.
Perfect. And we have another question here. The question is, thanks very much, Craig and Sitha. Understanding that this would play itself out very differently across utilities, could you walk us through a concrete example, including application and the barriers addressed and instruments deployed? Yeah.
Concrete, that sounds like a Sitha question.
Well, so I think I heard the question was barriers and obstacles and instruments deployed. Okay, so yeah. I would say one of the barriers that typically comes up was basically the question that was asked before this, which was a more hyper-focused concern on quality and trying to get information and all data correct in order to make decisions and to accurately define values of investments. And I think the reason why we presented this idea of having a maturity model is because that will vary from organization to organization, but it's not something that you have to wait for in order to start making this transition. Quality is relative from organization to organization. Data is relative. The information, the way in which you go about making decisions is relative. So the investments that you define within your organization will also be relative, but as long as you have it within a common framework, you're relatively making the right decisions that make the most sense for you and your constituents. Alongside with that, I think I think part of one of the things that we mentioned during the presentation was how organizational change management is a common issue. We see even with organizations that started to implement variations of value frameworks, the application of that value framework continues to be a struggle, and that's even more of that even pushes for more of a need, to put more effort into defining and making that more of a long-term component of how you structure investment planning within your organization. And I think a lot of times it's become an afterthought that change management is necessary, but what we've seen is even by having the right tools in place, if people aren't using the software just to make decisions in the right way or as effectively as possible, you're not going to get the value out of that. And once you get that organizational barrier, once you start to accomplish or overcome that organizational barrier, you can start to continually refine and optimize the solution. And that may involve developing more complex modeling tools. We mentioned models as being a component of the value framework. That's defined differently depending on who you speak to, but if you were to look at it in the context of just a copperleaf solution itself, models can be as simple as implement or answering questions to some guided questionnaires. It could also be more complex where you're taking data from different systems that have already started to quantify the risk and the values of certain investments and use that to compare across different investment needs. But those are all things that I think vary from organization to organization. And once you start to lay down the framework and the fundamentals, you can start to continue to revise that and add more models, add more tools, continue to train and make sure that we change the culture and mentality of the organization from siloed planning to more collaborative strategic planning.
I could add on to this as well, Farham.
Sure.
I guess to the point of the concrete example, I can provide a concrete hypothetical example perhaps that may help. So you think about the value framework and how do you make that tangible and real, right? It's like, how do you value transformational assets that aren't market proven, in some cases may not even be commercialized yet? How do you start to shift capital towards that from a very well established set of assets and business models that are well understood and can be valued using traditional methods? I think it's all about first alignment and setting the organizational risk tolerance and value drivers, right? There has to be alignment around that so that it's not that, so that each project or each function within the utility is coming to the table with a different set of inputs to the value framework or a different way of looking at it. You want to have that alignment first. So the simple hypothetical example, right, is there's plenty of utilities or energy companies out there today that have fundamentally stated that they will no longer invest in fossil fuel fired generation assets, right? That's not for everyone, but for those particular organizations, that is either a strategic or risk-based decision. So it's either a set of value factors that got them to that decision or a set of risks that got them to that decision. But those risks and those value drivers are established within the organization from top to bottom, and that then enables them to divert capital to other types of assets or competing assets, right, that are not central fossil fuel fired generation plants. That's just sort of almost a silly example, but it's an example of a value framework, whether they thought of it that way or not. So the challenge now is, as you go more granular with your asset program, and we start to apply the same concept to less and less centralized stuff, and then you start to see how challenging it is to establish those value drivers and quantify that risk, right? But if it can be done and well aligned, and you create a consistency and a control set, then it can, then you can really achieve something that is much more collaborative across the organization, but then also sort of and optimizable at the enterprise level.
Great, thanks, Greg. We did have a follow-up question to the first question. So a follow-up question on the journey of continuous improvement to the value framework. Have you worked with an organization that has reached its optimum level, and how long did it take for that organization?
So from my point of view, no, certainly not. And in fact, most of the real world examples that I have, we're still very much in the early stages, sort of wrestling with those, the characteristics of the value framework first, potentially in some cases starting to move into the implementation, starting to move into, okay, once we know that, what's the governance and control you need in place, and then what's the tool chest, or what are the system integration needs. I think Sita probably has some examples where he's got a little bit farther into the support side or the implementation side, but certainly from my perspective in Canada, and sort of being the Canadian energy providers lead, working primarily with Canadian companies, certainly more in the early stages.
Yeah, I agree. I think based on what we've seen at least a handful of organizations that strive for that kind of final stage 5 of like optimize strategic planning. But along the way, they've made little incremental steps to get there. For the most part, more and more organizations are doing value frameworks, but the transition is not something like flipping on the switch and all of a sudden with a value framework, you're going to optimize across your whole portfolio. Sometimes that takes time to make sure that you trust the data, you're making the right decisions, you're constantly testing it. You have to monitor the execution of those projects as well and start studying to see how they vary from what you expect, so you can actually use that data to help inform that value framework more effectively. So that transition can take multiple years to do, but along the way, you can incrementally improve things. For instance, at TVA, we enabled a process and a workflow for enterprise investment planning. They are using a portion of their funds or capital funds to be competed over across the enterprise, but not the entire portfolio is being competed across the enterprise. I think it's a very smart move. Another component of that is starting to look at how they can improve performance metrics and reports, and how they can use that to monitor how that portfolio management process is working. And from there, probably use the outputs of that to go ahead and enhance the value framework some more, and improve processes some more, and improve business cases some more. So it continues to be an evolving process. And I don't know if anybody will ever feel like they're 100% there, but at the end of the day, that effort does pull the organization together in terms of collaboration towards making investment decisions, being more objective about these investment decisions, being able to justify that more effectively, and spending a lot less time number crunching and dealing with kind of politics and siloed planning activities that we've confirmed today happens to be an issue with a lot of organizations.
Awesome, thank you. Quick final question, and then we can wrap up as we're approaching time. So in working with your clients, do you get questions about how utilities can adjust their asset management to integrate future climate parameters or risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the fundamental drivers of the transformation that we talk about are certainly related to that, right? To the 1D is decarbonization. So certainly climate change is one of the major drivers, and I think it's one of the drivers that in some cases value framework in the way that it exists today within organizations doesn't necessarily capture very well within the framework itself, or within the set of value drivers that you're attaching. But certainly the pace of adopting that as a as a driver within the framework and as a screening tool is increasing every day. I mean, it's becoming fundamental to the business. So I think it's a must in the future of asset planning.
Excellent. I think we are at time now, so we'll stop there. But I want to thank you again for answering those questions, and to our audience for taking the time to write those questions into our presenters. Before we end today's session, I'd like to remind folks to mark their calendars on our next webinars. So Thursday, May 6th, buyer meters will be running a line workers safety and tool training. On Thursday, May 13th, Hexagon will present on joint use management, streamlining a traditionally onerous process. All of CA's future events and webinars can be found in our monthly newsletter in current affairs, or you can go to the news and events section on our website at electricity.ca. In closing, I would once again like to thank Guidehouse very much for coming today, as well as Craig and Sita for presenting, as well as our audience for joining us. This concludes today's session, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now. Stay safe.
Thank you all. Take care.
Yes. Bye.